Good afternoon. Welcome to the side event, Autism and Motherhood Experience, Challenges and Positive Strategies. I wish to introduce myself. I'm Showman John. I'm Head of Secretariat to the Junior Minister and Honorably Antonia Jus de Celis. Unfortunately, the Junior Minister was unable to attend since he has family commitment, and he sends his apologies to all. I welcome our guests on the panel and all the guests and delegates for attending for this side event. I would like also to say that this side event is also being premiered on the UN website. This event was made possible through the Government of the Republic of Malta and UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UN-DESA. Our co-sponsors were the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, AFDO, Autism Research Centre, University of Cambridge, Department of Disability Studies, University of Malta, Inclusion International, International Disability Alliance, IDA, Autism Advisory Council, Malta, Commission for the Rights of Persons with Disability, Malta. Now I would like to thank and give the word to His Excellency, the Maltese Ambassador.
Thank you, Sean. Dear colleagues and guests, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this side event being organized by the Government of Malta in conjunction with UN-DESA. I am proud that our country have adopted an autism empowerment law back in 2016 and on the road to finalizing its first national autism strategy has chosen to put the specific themes of this side event on the agenda. While it is important to empower both autistic persons and their families, many a time we forget about those autistic persons who are also parents. These persons have to face the challenges which society creates, both vis-à-vis their autism and the respect of their role as parents, many times of children who are also autistic. Lack of understanding and support from society can, unfortunately, lead to situations in which not only do both parents and children not get to participate in society on an equal basis with others, but also to set situations in which child protective services, ostensibly for the good of the children, are involved without taking proper stock of the situation at hand. This leads to long-term consequences for both parents and children. Therefore, I am very glad that we can discuss the topic of autism and motherhood today, building upon the courageous and innovative research spearheaded by the Autism Research Centre at the University of Cambridge. Professor Simon Baron-Cohen and his team have long been known to be on the forefront of cutting-edge scholarship, and we are honored to have two members of that team with us today. Furthermore, within the framework of this Conference of State Parties to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it is important to keep in mind the guiding mantra of the Convention, which all member states present at this conference have ratified: nothing about us without us. It is useless discussing scholarship pertaining to autism and motherhood and to related challenges and phenomena without directly including the voice of those directly involved. In this regard, we are very glad that two of our panelists are also autistic mothers, additionally with a background in both advocacy and academia spanning a number of years. Finally, it is important to stress the value of collaborative efforts. While disabled persons must be in the lead of all decisions and policies affecting their lives and futures, we can never underestimate the impact of partnership with relevant stakeholders, so-called allies. And in keeping with the theme of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which Malta is also committed to implement, the theme Leave No One Behind, we are delighted to have representatives both based in Malta and elsewhere around the globe to contribute further life real-life experiences and discuss challenges, but most importantly, to offer recommendations as to possible strategies for moving forward. The wider perspective of parenting and intellectual disability, the human rights model of disability and best practices in advocacy, and the framing of the discussion within the context of the SDGs are all salient themes which our distinguished panelists will be tackling today. Most importantly, you, the audience, are very welcome as well to participate and engage the panelists in discussions, both during and after this side event is over. The overarching themes at hand are not country or region specific, but represent challenges that are experienced by autistic mothers everywhere. Malta hopes that this forum will plant the seed that will lead to further work in this area, further awareness, but finally also further empowerment with the aim of ensuring the end goal that no autistic mother will be left behind. I thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Carmel Anguares, for your words of welcome. Now we move to our speakers. I remember you that you have 7 minutes allocated for your presentation. And I start with the first speaker, Mr. Robert Vienne. Robert Vienne joined the United Nations in 1999 and worked on issues such as internal and international migration, family policy, social integration, mainstreaming, indicators development, demographic aging, and older persons with disabilities, and implementation of CRPD, program planning and management, as well as capacity development and partnership coordination. He liaises both with government and civil society representatives, as well as academia and the private sector. Mr. Vierne holds a degree in sociology with minors in political science and psychology from the Free University in Berlin, and spent 1 year studying at the New School for Social Research in New York. Mr. Vierne, you have the floor.
Chair. It is my great pleasure to represent the Division for Inclusive Social Development of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN Secretariat here today at this important event on autism and motherhood, which unfortunately has not received enough attention from policymakers so far. One vehicle to use to remedy this situation is awareness raising, and one venue to do so could be the World Autism Awareness Day, that is commemorated every year on the 2nd of April. The observance of the day at UN headquarters is organized by both our colleagues in the UN Department of Global Communications and us at UN-DESA in close cooperation with persons with autism and their representative organizations. This year's theme was Assistive Technologies, Active Participation, and themes in the past were empowering women and girls with autism toward autonomy and self-determination, autism and the 2030 Agenda, employment, as well as inclusive education. I strongly believe that autism and motherhood is long overdue to be highlighted during a future World Autism Awareness Day, either in Malta or in other member states or here at UN headquarters. The rights of persons with disabilities, including persons with autism, is enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, and they are an integral part of the UN's mandate. The Convention endeavors to elaborate in detail the rights of persons with disabilities and sets out a code of implementation. Countries that ratify the Convention engage themselves to develop and carry out policies, laws, and administrative measures for securing the rights recognized in the Convention and to abolish laws, regulations, customs, practices that constitute discrimination. Countries are to ensure the equal rights and advancement of women and girls with disabilities and autism. Persons with disabilities and autism are not to be subjected to arbitrary or illegal interference with regard to their privacy, family, home, correspondence, or communication. Discrimination relating to marriage, family, and personal relations shall be eliminated. Persons with disabilities or autism shall have the equal opportunity to experience parenthood, to marry and to start a family, to decide on the number and spacing of children, and to have access to reproductive and family planning education and means. All these provisions are of crucial importance to mothers with autism, and it is up to all of us to ensure that mothers with autism can live any life they want to. When world leaders adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, the international community reaffirmed its strong commitment to inclusive, accessible, and sustainable development and pledged that no one would be left behind. In this context, the participation of persons with autism as both agents and beneficiaries of development is essential for the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The goals are focusing, for example, on poverty elimination, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, decent work, and reducing inequalities. And all of these goals are extremely relevant to mothers with autism. Only by substantially increasing awareness raising on all aspects of the living conditions of mothers with autism and their children, and by fully implementing and mainstreaming both the Convention and the SDGs, will mothers with autism have realized their rights and their equal position in society. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert, for your intervention. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Kellie Cottam. Dr. Kellie Cottam specializes in the field of disability and sexuality. She has worked in various sectors of disability, including education, social care, staff training, and ultimately academia. In her professional experience, Dr. Cottam has worked directly with persons with intellectual disability, their families, and persons who work in disability-related professions. Currently, Dr. Cottam heads the Department of Disability Studies within the Faculty for Social Wellbeing at the University of Malta. She lectures across various departments and faculties, including that of sociology, social policy and social work, youth and community studies, family studies, gender studies, nursing and education, since disability intersects with so many aspects of life. Dr. Cottam's recent research work revolved around disability and sexuality, LGBTIQ, sexual health, sex education, and parenting. She has presented and published her academic research internationally with the intent of influencing policy and practice in the field.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I will be speaking about the experiences of disabled women in a local Maltese context, or maybe the absence of them. So Malta is an island nation state on the southernmost border of the European Union, which it joined in 2004. It is made up of 2 inhabited islands covering an area of just over 300 square kilometers, and Catholicism and affiliated family values exert a powerful influence on Maltese culture. Such notions impinge on the traditional role of women, as they tend to do in southern European countries. Within this context, it is unusual to talk openly about sex and sexuality, an area heavily influenced by religious mores. However, the sexuality of disabled persons are becoming increasingly recognized, as evidenced by Malta's ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in late 2012. Article 23 of the UNCRPD outlines the rights of disabled persons to explore and express their sexuality, have relationships, marry, and have children. Nevertheless, I'm one ahead. So strange. Nevertheless, the question remains as to what the experiences of disabled mothers in Malta are, as their stories remain censored, or even worse, sensationalized. The research carried out on this topic of motherhood in this context is today limited, and more needs to be known about the lived experiences and the specific requirements of disabled mothers. Given the dearth of research on the topic, these two pieces of research in which I was involved seek to identify and interpret the opportunities and difficulties experienced by disabled mothers in Malta. The qualitative research explores the intertwining and complex factors that emerge from the narratives of disabled women who are mothers or wish to be mothers in a Maltese cultural context. In Maltese culture, there are huge expectations on the woman. She's the one to rear the children. She takes care of them, keeps them clean, feeds them, takes them out. Cultural expectations of the responsibility of child rearing is placed squarely on the mother. However, while non-disabled women experience societal pressure to have children, disabled women are excluded from fulfilling traditionally female roles and are often advised to avoid pregnancy or relinquish their child. Disabled mothers have often resorted to hiding their state till quite late in the pregnancy. Disabled women are said to experience double discrimination, and their role as mothers augments their experiences of disablement. Disabled women who become mothers transgress social norms by highlighting their sexuality in a society that puts their disability before their motherhood. Mothers, more than fathers, are prone to criticism relating to parenting skills and ability, and are held accountable by professionals for not parenting in prescribed ways. These women operate within oppressive cultural ideologies of mothering and are likely to experience significant episodes of self-blame. Difficulties that disabled parents come across seem to confirm their parental inadequacy, while not taking into account structural issues such as poverty, poor housing, and lack of familiar support. As Waxman argues, beneath the asexual stereotype lurks the belief that disabled women's reproductive capacity is biological, moral, and an economic danger. This is reflecting in the underlying concerns that disabled mothers will produce defective babies and dysfunctional children. However, research has also demonstrated that many disabled parents are competent, can meet the required responsibilities, and can improve their skills with appropriate parent training, information, and direct assistance. In the research conducted in Malta, social factors were found to impinge on the experiences of disabled mothers to a greater extent than impairment-related factors. These social factors comprise the immediate support network of mothers, as well as wider cultural factors pertaining to being a disabled mother in Malta. I will now present some extracts from narratives that illustrated the experiences of disabled mothers in the research carried out locally. They told me, with your condition, how can you take care of a baby? And I told them, then you need to find me support. They told me there isn't any. It is significant that this mother had to give her baby up for fostering because of lack of support in looking after her son from her family and from service providers. She recounts how she faced negativity from a society that traditionally sees the family as composed of a mother and a father, and does not give equal value to alternative family arrangements. This position is also in line with the teachings of the Catholic Church, whose influence on Maltese culture is still strong. It is also worth considering whether her doubly stigmatized status as a disabled single mother also contributed to the professional's conclusion that she is unfit to mother. Such stigmatization makes parents aware of the devalued bodily capital of disabled persons. As literature points out, baby care manuals and pregnancy books present the overall message that disability is unlikely, undesirable, and to be avoided at all costs. When I came out of hospital and came around, I again spoke to my son's social worker. I asked her if I could see him at least twice a week. She told me that his foster parents couldn't make it. This mother recounts her experience with medical professionals while she was pregnant and later on when her daughter was born. Family ties are very strong in Malta, and she relied extensively on her sister-in-law. Medical professionals addressed her sister-in-law and made no attempt to explain to her in a way she could understand. Instead, her sister-in-law would explain what had been said later at home. This mother identified the need for support and recognized the fact that she would have to give up her daughter if her family had not supported her. Such social skepticism, as described in this quote, is encountered in the attitudes of those who see disabled women unfit to carry out the role of mothers due to their impairment. Although disabled women are not a homogenized group, it can be assumed that they are rooted within the same socially constructed categories that limit their sexual development, their life choices, and subsequently, their reproductive rights. While acknowledging that disability rights have come a long way and the experiences of women in the presented studies are significant in our understanding of how the intersection between their gender and impairment still influences their life trajectories. Disabled mothers challenge sociocultural stereotypes about disabled people, and especially disabled women. However, motherhood is often hindered by the societal and matriarchal expectations about them being disabled women. These societal and cultural attitudes rip these women from their rights and from full inclusion in society. Despite the laws and policies being in place, societal attitudes still marginalize disabled women from sexuality and childbearing. Dominant discourse about pregnancy and motherhood are rarely representative of disabled women in Malta. And there are still I lost it. Never mind. Next one. No, it's okay. I lost it. There. Next one. It is clearly observed how their gender and impairment intersects with the power relations exerted on them. The reproductive rights of disabled women are challenged with controlling and authoritarian attitudes from family and society. Often society does not recognize disabled women as mothers and thus questions their mothering responsibilities before they even occur. In contrast, the legal age of sexual consent in Malta was lowered to the age of 16 after long discussion in 2018, thus considering teenagers able to make informed decisions about their sexual health and reproductive rights. Stereotypical attitudes that disability is inheritable and that impairments are contagious lead to the discouragement of disabled women from engaging in any sexual activity with the aim of protecting them from getting pregnant and from their perceived inability to parent. The belief that being born to disabled parents, the children will experience discrimination and prejudice was also highlighted in the research. Keeping in mind that Malta is a small country, the communities are in close proximity. Disabled parents will be known to the whole community instantly, and the negative social judgments become the responsibility of disabled women or even of their mothers, who are encouraged to take measures to minimize the chance of their daughter's pregnancy. Despite all odds, Corinne Gregg, here in the picture, an intellectually disabled Maltese woman, became a mother and is raising her daughter with support from her family. However, she acknowledges the fact that had it not been for her family support, she could have lost her child to child protection services. The need of specific parental coaching and the lack of support services continue to reinforce the notion that disabled women are not seen as potential parents. On a positive note, Malta has recognized the need of a rights-based, person-centered approach with the launch of the National Strategic Policy for Positive Parenting in 2016. This policy identifies the need to work collaboratively with service providers in the field of disability to further empower disabled parents. This policy assures that the provision of psychological and family therapy support that will promote positive parenting and rejects the dominant discourse that disabled persons are not good enough parents. The ratification of the CRPD eventually led to Malta adopting its principles as a framework in the National Disability Policy, launched in 2014. The disability policy features a number of measures that would allow access to comprehensive sex education, supported living services for couples with disability, and support for disabled parents. Furthermore, a draft of a national disability strategy was launched for public consultation in 2016. The final strategy document is to be made available later this year. The strategy specifically lists support that would ensure that disabled parents can fulfill their role. Page 59. However, the lacuna in knowledge, awareness, and support for disabled mothers, and specifically autistic mothers, needs to be rectified. We know nothing on a local level about their experiences of motherhood, and this is an area that's been neglected in research, not just locally, but also in disability research in general. We need to look into best practice so as to be proactive and prepare needs-based and early intervention support these mothers require. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Tsopardelaine. Now to our next speaker, Connie Lorimbawi, Executive Director, Inclusion International. She's responsible for a global staff team, projects in every region of the world, and engagement with governments and international institutions. Connie reports to an international board of directors, recognized by the UN as the global organization of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. Inclusion International has over 200 national member organizations in 115 countries. Connie led Inclusion International representatives at the UN Ad Hoc Committee, negotiations that led to the CRPD. She directed Inclusion International's global campaigns on poverty, inclusive education, the right to live in the community, and the right to decide, and subsequently authored reports on those articles of the Convention.
And thank you for having me as part of the panel, and to our hosts for organizing the event that I think is a really important topic. I'd like to start by apologizing that you have the executive director of the organization on the panel. I think a more effective voice from our organization would have been one of the self-advocates who you may have met in other sessions during the Conference of States Parties over the last few days. There are so many side events, as you know, that we are all trying to cover in different places. I think it would have been very powerful for you to hear from one of the women self-advocates who's here on our team about her experience, not currently as a mother, but as a woman who I know would like to have a family in the future, and some of the challenges that she's facing. So alternatively, I'm going to tell you about some of the collective issues we've heard about from our member organizations around the world and from self-advocates who are the leadership of our movement. As my introduction indicated, Inclusion International has 115 national has organizations in 115 countries of the world. Many of those organizations are led by people with intellectual disabilities, and sometimes they're led by families, and sometimes they're led by people with disabilities who are parents. And so there's a lot of experience in our network about these issues. Last year, we hosted a global World Congress in Birmingham. We do these conferences every 4 years. And this year, before the Congress, we had a process where we talked to our membership and self-advocates in particular and parents about what the big issues in their lives still are more than 10 years after the ratification of the convention. And one of the most important issues that resonated and I think really gave us a important reminder was the issue for self-advocates of the right to have a family. And in that context, the right to get married, the right to make decisions about who they live with, the right to decide if you have children of your own. And we developed a series of calls to action out of the consultation we did with our members. And one of them is about the right to make decisions about your life, who you live with, how you have a family. In conversation with our self-advocate leadership, it's almost any meeting you go to in any of the countries where we have members and you talk to self-advocates about the most important thing in their lives, they will all say that the most, as a group, there will always be, at the highest part of that list is always, I want to be able to have a family. I want to have a girlfriend. I want to have a boyfriend. I want to have children. I want to make a life. And so when we start to unpack why that is, that people continue to be denied those rights, we understand, using the convention and our experience across many of these issues, that some of that has to do with the recognition of legal capacity. So Article 12 of the convention, as you all know, it relates to the right to make decisions in your own life. In many countries of the world, people continue to be denied the right to marry because of their legal capacity. They're denied the right to make decisions about their own sexuality, as we've just heard in Malta. And in addition to the legal restrictions that are placed on people in those decision-making capacities, there are social and normative restrictions that are made by their own families. So very often what happens is self-advocates live at home. Independence and being able to live in the community requires supports, and so their own families are often protective of them and want them to make decisions that fit within the larger, broader family context. So I think there's a larger discussion about what role family can play in empowering and supporting people as they become independent and make decisions about their lives. The other thing I think that's really clear in many countries is that we continue to have a gender challenge in terms of disability in the area of reproductive health and sexuality, but also very specifically, we continue to see in some countries of the world forced sterilization. This is one of those issues that I think we need to rise to the top of our campaigning. It's an issue, to me, it is such a violation of human rights in the alongside of things like shackling in countries. This can't continue to be something that we permit to happen globally, and so we're going to be taking that on with many other partners. We can't do it alone as an organization, but we are trying to raise it as an awareness issue. And this forced sterilization, we think of as something that happens in countries where the human rights records are already bad. But in a lot of countries, it happens implicitly. So what happens is women are sterilized without their consent because they don't fully understand what is happening. And I think this happens in countries like the United States and in places, not just, this is not a low-income country issue. This is something that's happening around the world and continues to happen. I think the last thing I want to just touch on, two more things. One is that we also see very often that when people with intellectual disabilities do have relationships and they get married or they live together and they have children, they are often under enormous scrutiny by child welfare systems. And they always live in fear that their children are going to be taken away. And that's true, again, across income, wealthy countries and low-income countries. And the mythology here is that it's about their capabilities. In fact, it's about a failure in our systems to support families to care for children. And here, I think, I know that the panel discussion is particularly focused on motherhood of women with disabilities who have children. There's a crossover here, however, to mothers of children with disabilities, because parent support is poorly understood. How do you support a parent who has a child with an intellectual disability, or how do you support a woman who has an intellectual disability with her children? The whole infrastructure that we have in most countries, that it denies families support. And so what happens is families become blamed when children are institutionalized or taken away and put into welfare systems. So families are inadequate, or families don't know how to care, when in fact it's our systems that are designed to say, well, the professionals can do it, but we're not going to actually give families any help. But if you move children into the foster care environment, foster families are given support. But at home, where their parents are, we can't do that. We don't have those, there's nothing to support you. So there's a real, I think, when we were negotiating the convention, we fought hard for the preamble in the convention that respects the role of families. I think we have to unpack that and talk about what that means both for people with disabilities who have families of their own, and more broadly for families who have children with disabilities. I will stop there. I would be happy to have an opportunity to have a conversation about some of these issues. I would just say that for Inclusion International, we're an organization that's 60 years old. We were founded by parents who had children with disabilities who were looking to do something better in the world for their family members. And today, 60 years later, we are led by self-advocates themselves alongside of families, and we continue to think that that's a strong voice, to have a united voice with self-advocates and families to say, how can we do this better?
Thanks, Connie. Our next speaker, Dana Gesner. Dana Gesner is a master's degree social worker and a PhD candidate at Adelphi University and an adjunct faculty member for the Autism Certificate Program at Towson University. She is a national board member for the RQS and is an appointed member to the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee's work group on healthcare disparities. She has co-authored 3 books, Scholars with Autism, College for Students with Disability, and recent Amazon bestseller, Spectrum Women, Walking to the Beat of Autism, and the third in press, Treatment on the Spectrum, Diverse Intervention for Adolescents and Adult Clients with Autism Spectrum Disorder, Routledge Press. She is a wife, mother, grandmother, and an autistic woman who seeks to live an authentic life, not in spite of, but embracing her autistic identity.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to be here. Thank you so much for including me. And I just want to take a deep breath here and have everybody pause, because things have been going very quickly. We're trying to be conscious of everyone's time. But I just want to let the whole room go, for a minute. I just want to thank my colleagues who've already spoken. Very specifically, I think Claire, without overtly saying it, has emphasized how badly we need to focus on qualitative inquiry about the lived experiences of people with disabilities. We have spent so much time and money and effort looking for a cure. We have stopped listening to what people really want and need. So I just want to thank you for that. And Connie, I just want to say to you that I appreciate so much what you said about forced sterilization, but I would say that what Monique and I are going to speak to may step one effort more toward cruelty, and that is allowing a person to have a child and then withholding them at the hospital. That is even more cruel and inhumane than doing a forced sterilization. And so I just wanted to take a moment to emphasize that. Thank you. So I want to talk about, we're sort of having a sequence here. We've talked a great deal about intellectual disabilities, but my role today and what I want to focus on today is the next segment of the autistic community, and that is women who experience autism that is not outwardly manifesting. I choose not to use high and low functioning. I use internalizing expressions of autism and externalizing. And for many women, many men on the spectrum, many of us have learned to internalize our features of autism. We're socially constructed to do that. We're designed to do that for mere survival. But what that means to people whose autism isn't evident is we face, as Ann Davis says, a double bind, because every single time I request an accommodation, I once again have to disclose. I come out of the closet 7 or 8 times to make a flight across the country. And that burden, that constant burden, means I either forego the assistance I need, as Ann says, or I have to face the obstacle, and I lose cognitive capacity by trying to power through. I don't do that anymore. I'm comfortable disclosing, but for many of us, that's an undue burden. And so when we enter into a hospital situation in terms of our motherhood, that requirement to disclose may have to happen repeatedly, and that's an extraordinary demand on the part of a woman. I am going to run through some slides here. I will be posting my segment of the presentation on my PowerPoint in the Center for Understanding webpage, because I'm going to have to go through these quickly. But since I'm in the middle of a very late PhD, I'm a late bloomer. I've been my son's mother, attorney, doctor, advocate for the last 25 years. Now it's my turn. He's doing well. I'm doing hardcore research now, and I want to bring some hard numbers to this conversation. So looking overall at the autistic community, what we've learned in the last several years is that suicidal ideation in this population is at 66%, yet only 35% have disclosed attempts, and only 31% report depression. Sarah Cassidy's research. Crowan has found 5 times the rate of suicide attempts, as have Birkenstoddard out of Canada. The average lifespan for an autistic person is 37 years of age. 37 years of age. And many of those occur because of late diagnoses of medical conditions, because of the expression of autism. It's discussed as just being a feature of the disability. It's just behavior when someone is actually literally dying before your eyes. Healthcare access is denied due to multiple barriers, including executive function over medication, communication breakdowns, anxiety, depression. Phone phobia is very real. A lack of providers is just tremendously complicated for our community. Co-occurring issues include all of the same features that are identified now in the ACEs research about adverse childhood experiences. So there's an intersectionality there of a Venn diagram and overlap. And in terms of childbearing, we're seeing issues of custody actually affecting the birth outcome because of the undue anxiety. Fear about their own capacity. Women are reporting hyperfocus. I was one of those mothers where, I would have a meltdown if someone served me a beverage with caffeine because I was so afraid of the health for my baby. And by the way, I didn't know I was autistic until long after I had children. Diabetes, hypertension, these are all anxiety-related issues to pregnancy and birth. Poverty is a very real need that all autistic people face. In the United States, the federal poverty line for single adults is $11,000, and the annual income on our social service benefit program of Social Security is only $8,800. And it doesn't matter whether you live in West Virginia, where my son paid $800 a month rent, or whether you live in New York City, where, of course, the rent is astronomical. The poverty rate is twice as high for disabled people. And according to research by Shattuck and Company, only 17% of autistic adults 21 to 25 have ever lived independently, as compared to 34% of their ID peers. So we really need to do a better job of inclusion, mental health support that's customized for this. And we need to break down the silos. I'm a social worker, and I'm very disappointed in our profession because we operate under the idea that in terms of social work, it's something that happens over there. And in reality, no matter what field of social service you practice, domestic violence, homelessness, poverty-based issues, whatever you do, you're working with autistic people, whether you know it or not. Non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. 50% of our population report it, and women with autism are much more high in their endorsement of non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. This can devolve into cutting, and then it can devolve into suicidal behavior. Anorexia manifests differently in our population. It's not about looking good, it's about making our bodies get quiet from the sensory assault we experience. And so the treatment and the protocols we use for treating eating disorders are not functional for our community as they're now done. Gender, when we talk about sexuality, we have to remember gender expression and gender diversity. And I know many people who are in the IDD community who experience gender diversity. The US is very far behind on their research, but you can see the research here that one sample set a higher number of gender dysphoric traits, 7% higher in another study, and 7.1% of females as compared to males at 4.8 reported gender fluidity in their profiles in these very important studies. So we need to respect all manifestations of sexual diversity. The NAS questioned adults on the spectrum. 2/3 of the people at the time of the interview said they needed someone to prompt them or to help them wash or dress, and 86% said they hadn't washed at the time of the interview. I mean, that's heartbreaking. That's real information. Women are more vulnerable to abuse on the spectrum. 40% of them in one study reported sexual abuse compared to 26% of non-autistic people. Muggings are higher, physical and emotional abuse are higher. So there's an association between autistic traits, childhood abuse, trauma victimization, and PTSD. This is a picture I cherish. I'm going to tear up. This is my daughter and myself and my grandson. And I put this picture here to notify you that you do not outgrow autism. You don't grow out of your accommodations. The reason people are dying is because we make you think you're supposed to outgrow your supports and your services. And the most successful autistic adults are people who have grown into knowing what they need and developing the capacity to ask for that in a competent and cohesive way. And if they can't do that independently, we need to facilitate that. The girl on the left in this image is me. The girl on the right is me speaking at World Autism Awareness Day. And if you think I've outgrown my autism, I'm going to end with this note. I want you to look at the woman in this picture. I'm standing next to a beautiful young woman named Chloe Rothschild, who's grown up always knowing about her autism, as my son has. There's great benefit in having your identity from the beginning. I didn't get my diagnosis till 38. I want you to look at the difference in a late diagnosed person and a person who's always grown up with their identity. Chloe is to my right wearing her ear defenders. She's got a communication device with her, and she's looking at me completely bewildered, me, her role model, trying to figure out what is wrong with me. I'm the late diagnosed woman standing there having no capacity to cope because the room, just like the UN today, has not been accessible for people like me with sensory processing issues. And if you look closely at my face, I can't even function to exit the space. So imagine what childbirth must have been for me. Without a diagnosis, without any capacity to say what I needed. Birth didn't happen to me, birth happened at me. And we're going to talk more about that today. I thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thanks, Dana. And our next speaker is Sarah Karine Crockford. Sarah is currently a PhD candidate in theoretical and applied linguistics at the University of Cambridge. Her research is primarily focused on bilingual language processing in autistic adults and children. However, she has worked on numerous other projects. These include the work she is presenting today on the experience of motherhood for autistic women, a research project based at Autism Research Center, University of Cambridge.
So thank you for the introduction, and thank you to my invitation to come here today. So I'm going to be presenting on work that me and another former doctorate student at the Autism Research Center started in collaboration with Monique, who is here today. And so I'm just kind of presenting some preliminary results. So we're still in the process of publishing the work, and this was started about 4 or 5 years ago. So it's going to be very brief and more data-driven, but I hope it will kind of help foster the discussion that we're having here today about motherhood for autistic women. So like I mentioned, the study was started quite a while back. So in 2014, Alexa, who was the lead on the project, was approached by Monique to run this study on autistic women and motherhood. And one of the main reasonings behind this was that there was really no, even at the time, and it's increasing today, but there was no empirical work that was conducted on motherhood and autism, which made it very difficult then for autistic mothers to advocate for themselves, for the children, and to get sort of support from agencies without this sort of extra support from empirical scientific evidence that something like a study at the University of Cambridge could provide. So, as I mentioned, there was very little research at the time. There's still very little research today. And a lot of the research is currently focused on the experience of childbearing and pregnancy. And so far, I've not been able to find a published study that's looked at the lifelong experience of autistic women. So even though the data we collected about 4 or 5 years ago feels very, very much a long time ago, it's still really relevant today, what we have to say. So the way we went about to collect this information is we developed an online survey, and this was done in a collaborative method with 6 autistic mothers themselves who helped us create the survey items that we asked. They developed the research questions that we were interested in, and they essentially gave us the foundations to run this project, without whom it would not have been possible. Because normally when we work in scientific research, we'll come up with a question, we'll read the literature, we'll see what the rest of the scientific world has to say, and then go about it that way. But having no background to rely on, it was really imperative that we relied on the experiences and the voices of these women who participated in our study. So the survey asked a variety of questions that were meant to encapsulate the lifelong experience of motherhood. So they did start from childbearing all the way up to sort of parenting and experience of motherhood at an emotional level, and also advocating for one's child with professionals, which could be clinicians, teachers, pediatricians, educators, etc. And we also included some extra questions on child protective social services. So the data that I'm presenting today is only from our forced choice items. So they were items on the survey where parents had to, or mothers had to, either agree or disagree or answer yes or no. So it's sort of a more quantitative way of describing this experience, and obviously doesn't capture the whole breadth of what motherhood can be like. But we did also have some sort of qualitative open-ended questions, which hopefully going on we will be able to present at some point in time. So the women in our study, we collected data from, I think thousands of women clicked on our online survey. However, when it came down to it, we had about complete responses from 132 control mothers. So these were mothers who reported either not having a diagnosis of autism or not self-identifying as autistic. And we had 235 diagnosed women with autism and 120 who identified as being autistic. And it was very important that both of these groups were included, because for many women, they might not have had the opportunity to either yet receive a diagnosis of autism or had the sort of resources that would enable them to receive this diagnosis. So it meant that we had a chance to include as many mothers on the spectrum as possible. So 87% of mothers actually in our groups reported at least having one autistic child, which meant that and this was both in the control group and the autistic group, which meant that we included the results only from mothers who had at least one autistic child. So this was an additional experience that we accounted for in our survey. So what did we find? So firstly, over 60% of mothers in our sample who either had a diagnosis or suspected they had autism came to this conclusion after the birth of one of their children. So this was primarily late diagnosed mothers. 40% of autistic mothers, and so the numbers in brackets represent the control data, so the mothers without autism as comparison. So 40% of autistic mothers experience antenatal depression, so it's sort of similar figures to what Dina presented earlier on depression, and 60% reported experiencing postnatal depression, which is an extraordinarily high figure if we consider that the average rates for typical women ranges between 10 to 15% currently. So, and then 34% of autistic women did not feel like they had the process of birth adequately explained. And further to the birthing process, 64% of autistic women had difficulties breastfeeding their first child and 51% their second. So we also, like I said, asked questions about kind of the more lifelong experience of parenthood. And so we asked questions about how autistic mothers coped with organizational skills and multitasking, sort of the more domestic lifestyle of parenting. So 44% of autistic mothers didn't feel like organized parents, and almost half of the sample struggled with coping with multitasking that was required with parenting. And again, 53% found that they have difficulties with coping with the domestic responsibilities of parenthood. And so further to these questions, we wanted to ask the autistic women in our survey if they felt like they should receive or that they needed additional support because of their autism, and whether, in addition, they'd received the support that they'd required if they'd asked for it. And the autistic mothers reported that 61% of them reported that they would require this additional support. However, that when they had asked for it, only 14% reported that they'd received the adequate support they required, which is a huge discrepancy here in actually the support services that are tailored to the autistic mothers, and sort of echoes what has been spoken about today. With regards to the emotional experience of motherhood, a majority of autistic mothers in our sample found it to be an isolating experience, and a lot of them were afraid to be judged on their parenting skills and didn't feel like they could turn for others for support. And so then we also asked further questions about communicating with professionals. Like I said, this includes clinicians, educators, teachers, anyone that a mother might come into contact with regards to her child. And although the majority of mothers actually reported they could communicate well with professionals on behalf of their child, but when we delved deeper into those questions, we found that actually a lot of them ended up in conflict with professionals when they were discussing their child. A majority of them encountered disbelief about what they were claiming or what they were talking about with professionals. And again, a majority of them reported that they found it difficult to know what details to share. 60% again reported that talking to professionals was so anxiety-inducing they couldn't think clearly. And actually, to follow up on that, we also discussed, we asked them about communication difficulties, and 44% reported experiencing communication difficulties or even selective mutism, which was something that that was discussed in our panel discussions when we were developing the survey. And so we also asked about disclosure of autism, and we asked this of the diagnosed mothers and of the non-diagnosed mothers. And of the majority of mothers, well, more mothers who were diagnosed reporting disclosing their autism.
Just to let you know, 1 minute left.
Okay. Then non-diagnosed mothers. And over 80% of both diagnosed and non-diagnosed mothers were worried that professionals' attitude towards them would change as a result of disclosing. And again, quite a high proportion of them found disbelief from professionals once they disclosed their diagnosis. We also wanted to highlight positive aspects. And so again, huge percentages of mothers still found that motherhood was rewarding for them, that they are always looking for opportunities to boost their child's self-confidence, and that they could always prioritize their child's need over their own. So in spite of challenges that they faced as autistic mothers, there was still this positive attitude towards motherhood. So very briefly, I'll touch on the questions that... Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I'm just... Okay. Yeah, sorry. So these are just to the last slide. So these are the statistics that we reported on the involvement with social services. So a high rate of autistic mothers were involved with child protective services, and an extraordinary rate faced allegations of conditions like Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is very alarming in our sample. So I will close by acknowledging all our collaborators and our funders, and I will leave the floor to the next speaker.
Thanks, Sarah. Our next speaker, Monique Blakemore. Monique is with Autism Asperger's Advocacy Australia, A4, a member of the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations. She represents A4 on the board of the Australian Autism Alliance. Monique is also a collaborator on a project at the Autism Research Centre, University of Cambridge, investigating the experience of motherhood for autistic women.
Thanks, Sean. I've been sitting here and all of a sudden I'm being confronted with an Apple PC, and it's very different, and it's kind of like autistic people dealing with non-autistic people, that we're kind of the same, but we're not really. We've got different operating systems. Neither one of them is defective, we're just different. And so I'm actually probably not going to use my slides because that's a level of multitasking I can't do. But I'd like to just make it clear that Sarah talked about the allegations of Munchausen's by proxy. In the UK, when I was working as a parent advocate, I was helping mothers obtain the supports that they needed from their local councils. In different countries, these allegations against parents, the difficulties that mothers are facing, it's not, although the data that we obtained, we had to get permission from the Chief Justice of the Family Court to even ask the questions, because women are gagged from being able to speak out about their experience. And if they do, they face jail. So even to ask if they were involved in child protection, we had to get that permission. But in France, they've got therapies like the packing therapies, and they've got children being put in institutions, and they've got a terrible track record when it comes to treating autistic parents, Sophie being one of them. And the problem that we had is that as soon as parents were trying to obtain the right supports, almost like a default, it was that we were exaggerating what our children needed, or we were making it up. And these mothers were having quite severe communication difficulties with the people who were there to support them and their children. But, and it would go into child protection, and a lot of them were losing their children. It's one of those areas that charities, it's not sexy. No one wants to deal with this. You don't want to back the wrong family. Charities have funders to worry about. And we're really lucky that Simon Baron-Cohen and his team decided to work on this, because at the time nobody else would. And for as long as it was isolated mothers' voices, we did not have the credibility to get any kind of change, which is unfortunate, that our voices and our lived experience isn't deemed to be enough. It's not credible enough to be heard. And there's great importance to self-advocacy. I'd like to say with a lot of women, they're not finding out that they're autistic until their children are diagnosed. And for mothers who are involved, who are having difficulties with having services understand them, they're finding out that rather than finding out that they're autistic and that being, the beginning of understanding of themselves, they're finding out in quite traumatic circumstances. I had a mother who'd say to me, the worst thing that ever happened in her life was becoming autistic. She doesn't mean that she suddenly acquired autism. You don't acquire autism, you're born with it. What she meant is suddenly the way that the systems were interacting with her was the most traumatic thing to happen to her in her life. And I felt really sad because that shouldn't have been the case. Her capabilities as a parent should have been supported. You know, our children do things differently. They need a different kind of parenting, and we're kind of okay with that. We can naturally structure our home lives to accommodate that. And I know certainly we have enough of my kids' friends come to our house and they don't want to go home, and we have tears and kids running out the back and hiding and what have you. And, you know, it's not necessarily what you do, it's what you don't do. Home is a haven. Home is where you can live an authentic, autistic life free of the pressures of constantly trying to fit into a world that is not designed for you. And it's exhausting. You know, an actor gets up on a stage, they put on their show, and they only do it for a few hours, and then they go home and they relax. Every time we walk outside our door, we're constantly making adjustments, but we find that the world doesn't always even meet us halfway. Which is great that in Malta you've got your autism strategy. In Australia we're hoping that our government will get one. We need one, you know. I'm glad the UN are doing their accessibility, because it's been really hard work being here the last few days, and you know, there's been a couple of ugly cry moments, I can tell you. Not pretty, but totally unavoidable for even the best of us that are used to it. My kids are on the spectrum. When my oldest son, I've got a 26-year-old daughter who I'm immensely proud of. She's living a life that makes her happy. She's doing very well in her career, and, you know, I just like to think that she got the absolute best of me. Probably it's more about her and who she is than anything we did, because, I don't know, I think we lucked out with her. But I've got a 15-year-old son and a 14-year-old son, and I know when we were trying to get... My youngest son was more external in his autism. He was picked up relatively quickly. My other son, my 15-year-old, as a family, you know, we had the old, it's attachment disorder. You know, you've failed to form the connections. For our family, we had the benefit of already having professionals coming into our home, knowing us, knowing the way we parented, and they advocated for us. And I think that every mother should have an advocate beside her whenever there's concerns about her family and her capacity to parent. She should be given support. But very rarely does adult services come and work alongside children's services where there's concern for the children. You know, children have the right to be living, you know, free of abuse and neglect, but you know, it's the worst abuse that you can inflict on a child is to remove them from a loving family with people like them, and based on neuronormal narratives of how we should exist. It's not right. I have to, because whenever you talk about men, you have women, you have men who say, what about us? So I'm going to just say we have a lot of fantastic autistic dads, and there's been some recent research about neuromixed relationships, and which kind of said what the community already knew, that, you know, online forums can be really destructive. The neurotypicals, the non-autistic people, they like to pathologise and they attribute negative aspects of their relationships to autism rather than looking at the person as an individual. Professionals really need to be monitoring for signs of abuse where one partner is autistic, because it can be really quite difficult. These women can use their dad's diagnosis in child custody cases, and again, sometimes dads won't parent necessarily like a mother, but, you know, probably nor should they. They do it differently. I know if you have a look at the photos, there's lots of kind of parallel play. You've got one son on his tablet, his dad on a book. It's parallel play. You know, that's an autistic way of doing things. It's the way we do it. We can share our stims. There they are with fidget spinners. Autistic life is a natural component to society, and it's one that should be respected. I'm going to play, very, very aware of time, I'm going to play a video of a mother that I was supporting. If you take offence to swearing and you want to complain about that after watching this video, I won't say I won't judge you, because I probably will, because this was taken when Kellie had gone to court. She had no legal representation. She wasn't allowed to take an advocate into the courtroom. She was given a judgment and asked to go across the road to a cafe to read the judgment. And it was in a busy cafe that she learnt that her children were going to be adopted.
Hereafter, i.e. after the expiry of the appeal time limited, I set this out clearly for the benefit of the mother, because she does not have legal representation. He wants me to appeal. He wants me to take it to the... Right, why do I think that these people are on my side? Why do I think that these people know that the system is fucked and they're fucking hoping to God I find the keys? Why do I feel like I've been put in a situation... It's like that. The guy who comes out and serves me says, Kellie, you have no idea. 30 years we've waited for someone like you. 30 years, so nobody's had the balls like you. So why does it fit? He's actually, right, and I haven't got this RB thingamajic. Can you go online and find this RB thingamajig in a minute? Because this hearing proceeds on the basis recommended by blah, 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 following written evidence and submission without oral... I don't understand.
If there's anything that I'd hope that people kind of go away and think about, is that
articulate doesn't mean non-disabled. You know, we have been struggling to survive under a medical model of disability. We went to the other extreme, talking about a social model for disability, and what we're asking you to frame is a social relational model, which says we can experience social breakdowns from the societies we're trying to live in. We can be capable. We can all achieve our own individual best, whether that means this week we didn't self-injure, and next week it means that we were able to keep all the balls in the air for a week without a meltdown. But it also means we have needs. We have real legitimate needs. And we're asking society to get past their bias, thinking that if you don't sound disabled, if you don't look disabled, you're not disabled. Vice versa, if you sound and look disabled, you're incapable. We can hold all of these dichotomies in our minds at the same time, and service models need to be based on that. It can't be based on subjective observation, and we need to listen to these lived experiences to shape our social structure.
In the UK, there's a psychologist who's giving a masterclass in fabricated illness, and in her masterclass, one of the reasons for why a woman would fabricate her child's illness, she says, is the mother's autism spectrum disorder. Now, if you replace autism with the name of any other minority group, people would be up in arms. And instead, councils are paying this person to say this about us. And these are the councils that are taking
the children away. And this slide is actually from her PowerPoint presentation. And you can see it clearly right there.
And that's all I can say.
Thanks, Monique, and thanks all to the speakers. It was simply amazing to hear from autistic mothers themselves and how good it is to have research at last. I am hopeful that there will be more autistic women's voices and that they will be heard more. Now I open the discussion to the floor if there are any questions. Yes?
Thank you very much. My name's Liz. I'm from the Australian Federation Disability Organisation. Ambassador, guests, panel, Monique and Dina, thank you so much for the journey that you've shared this afternoon. It was really, really powerful, and it really resonates that we've got to do a whole lot more in the autism space. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes?
Also, thank you to everybody on the panel. It was fantastic presentations. I just want to sort of talk about, I'm Matthew from People with Disability Australia, and one of the things that our members frequently talk to us about is the issues that women with disability find, agree in every sort of point that has been made around the various attitudes, stigmas and barriers that are created around the sexualities and reproductive capacity of women. One of the things we also get a lot of complaints about is the difficulties women have when they are accessing or wanting to access reproductive assistive technology. So women who are single, women who are needing support to become pregnant, and then the way that their sort of bodies are treated and the way that their zygote, embryo or fetus is treated on the same sort of stigmatizing values around that there are some people that we want to be born and then there are some people that we don't want to be born, and then those, the selection going on in those environments where there are zygotes, embryos, fetuses that are selected because they don't have disability, or disability is screened out at that point, or intersex variation is screened out at that point. And it's an area I think that we need to do a lot of work in terms of the sort of bioethics space, particularly in reproductive technology, because it's often in a sort of private health space, and we have doctors, just playing God, making these decisions around, who's born and who's not, and that in Australia is going on very much unchecked at the moment.
Thanks. Anyone from the floor? Yes?
Thank you very much for the overview. I think it was very, I learned a lot. I'm from the ombudsperson in Norway, and I must also say that I'm quite new to this kind of discussion surrounding the CRPD and people with autism. So you'll have to bear with me if I have a bit of amateurish questions. But I'm wondering first for the researcher from Cambridge. Oh yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm from the ombudsperson in Norway, and I have a question to the researcher from Cambridge. As autism is it's cover a very wide spectrum. How do you deal with that when you try to get the empirical data to tell about the life prognosis? You also have both diagnosed people and undiagnosed persons. So I'm just wondering how you reflect on this wide spectrum issue. And the second question I have goes to you, yes, I forgot your name, and that regards the sterilization and the problem with not recognizing legal capacity. Is that a specific group of the autistic people, or is it autistic persons who have also combined diagnosis? That is my question.
So just to quickly answer your question on how to capture, I think what you're discussing is sort of the range of kind of intellectual disability that can vary. So, like, for example, like Dina was discussing about internalizing and externalizing autism, how different it is for different people. I think it is very difficult in research, and unfortunately with the methods that we use, particularly for this study, we were only able then to include women who were literate or could access the survey online, because obviously it required a degree of understanding of the questions and reading through them. So I think it's sort of more of a starting point, for further researchers to then go and then try to somehow capture the experiences for mothers who might not be able to access the research in the way that we conduct it at this stage. I hope that answers your question.
So I think your question for me was related to legal capacity and for sterilization. So it's not unique to autism that people are denied their legal capacity. This is an issue but particularly in the area of forced sterilization. So many people many women with disabilities in all parts of the world, either by legislative or policy mechanisms, are forced, literally, to be sterilized. In other cases, legal capacity is much more in terms of informed consent. So if a woman fully understands the choice, it's an entirely different situation. And again, that applies to people with intellectual disabilities, and I think it also speaks directly to the question about people's ability to understand and receive information and process that information. And very often, people can't express their consent because they aren't able to communicate in traditional ways. And so there is one Supreme Court decision on this issue, which was a Canadian Supreme Court decision that predates the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It was called the Eve case. And in the Supreme Court of Canada, they said, if you cannot determine that consent has been given, then consent has not been recognized. So I think there's a burden on the duty bearers to ensure that consent has been received, and if a person's unable to communicate it, then it's not been received, and that is not in practice what happens.
And I think it's very important to remember two things. Many women who are diagnosed with intellectual disability have autism that is not diagnosed. Yeah. And as you saw in the video clip and you've seen with the two of us today, sometimes we have great expressive language and we can't understand what's being said to us. And the way the neurology works is when the hippocampal region is challenged by a crisis, language shuts down. So our capacities diminish in a crisis. The last thing I want to say is not all of the forced sterilization is very overt, as we've kind of alluded to. Sometimes it's very well-intentioned parents who are just simply fearful of their adult child undergoing an unwanted pregnancy and not having the capacity to cope with that. And they are almost manipulated by social systems to say, don't you want to protect her? Don't you want to keep her safe? Oh, she can't take a menstruation. But they're not giving her any behavioral support for that. And they wind up doing the sterilization in a way that's like, oh, don't you want to not have cramps and periods anymore? Let's do something that'll make it easier. So it isn't always so overt. Exactly right. It's often very subtle, and it's a quiet thing that goes on behind the scenes that's a hidden secret. Thank you.
Thanks. I have another question for myself.
Trevor Carroll, Australian Federation of Disability Organisations. It's not a question, it's more a comment. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all the panellists, but in particular I would like to congratulate the organisers of this event, because by far it's the best structured side event that I've attended in the whole 3 days I've been here. I mean, it built to an amazing climax. We started off with the underpinning convention and the new policies and stuff that's going on in Malta. We built into some research. But for me, the climax of the whole thing, the most moving part, was listening to our two mums tell their story and what it's like from their perspective. All of the stuff we heard prior to that was fantastic in terms of how it respects human rights and how we can make that work. But to hear the stories, the powerful stories of the mum, it was like a movie. It's like the end of a movie. It was just, I'll go away from here. That will never leave me. That I almost cried. Almost cried. It was really hard not to. Thank you very much, ladies. Thank you very much, ladies. Thank you for the organisers. That was absolutely brilliant, the way it was structured. Congratulations. Well done.
Thank you, sir. So, are there any questions on the floor? Yes, madam? Yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Heidi. I'm from Women with Disabilities Australia. Thank you to everyone. That was amazing. My question, to start with, I'll mention that I'm part of a project where our intention is to provide women with disabilities of all types of disabilities with resources on their rights around things like lots of things, but one of the areas is things like contraception, sexual and reproductive health, and rights to do things like be a parent and choose whether to have contraception and things like that. And I guess my question is, what it's a fairly broad question, but feel free to answer it however you like. How do you think is the best way to do that, and what types of information are most needed when we know that people, of course, have those rights, but I guess how do you tell a woman with autism, for example, that she has a right to be a parent when you know that also there is that risk that governments will try to take children away?
I think that really, it starts with schools. The school that my kids go to, I've got one child who's in an autism unit, and that is the most appropriate setting for him. And I have another son who the autism unit has successfully transitioned into mainstream, and that's hurting my wallet because he's learning about non-autistic people's need for brands and, that kind of social currency, and I don't get it, but, there you go, it happens. It's a whole new world. But they have a girls group for the autistic girls, and it's a large unit. There's about 60 kids. 10% of the school population is autistic, which tells you that a lot of families recognise that it's a great school and want their kids to go there. But they, for the last few years, have had a girls group. They teach the girls about relationship boundaries, what's a good relationship, what's not a healthy relationship, how not to lose yourself in a relationship, because a lot of autistic people will have, look for a mask who will kind of let us hide behind. It can be comforting to do that. So they're teaching the girls how to stand up and for themselves, and there's the sex education, because it has to be targeted to the way girls process information. Otherwise, they haven't received it. But I think with parenting, the way we are doing it with our kids is we don't know how they're going to grow into their autism. We don't know what, potential can't be measured. So if every child has unlimited potential, and you just leave everything on the table and see what happens. And we're committed as parents to support them in their choices.
And we've talked a great deal here about women having the right to do wonderful things with their bodies. One thing we haven't touched on is women having the right to do something other than have children. Some women with disabilities do not want to have children. They should be able to make that choice for themselves. And we have to be careful in our sex education classes to make sure we're being LGBTQ friendly. How many of you in this room would initially think it was perfectly okay to teach a child that holding hands in public is okay? But if you're gay, can you do that? It's very risky, right? So we have to be sure that we recognize sexuality takes many different manifestations. And as I had one colleague who's a mother of 2 children who has now transitioned into being a dad. He went over 20 years without getting the gender change surgery he wanted, because every time he approached a surgeon, they said, "Oh, you're just confused because you're autistic." And he endured far too many years of depression and anxiety because that need was not being properly addressed. So when we talk about controlling one's body and making one's choices, we need to be very careful that we're remembering the entirety of the sexual expression in our world. Happy Pride, by the way. Thank you.
If there are no questions left, I would like to wrap up. But before I wrap up, I want to say a big thanks to Dr. Elisa De Gaetano for making this possible, for your technical advice and assistance. Thanks. I would like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Carmel Anguanes, all the speakers, and all of you who have attended today's event. Leave no autistic mother behind. Autism and Motherhood, Experiences, Challenges and Positive Strategies, COP's 12-side event. I would like, before I conclude, to thank the organizers, the Government of the Republic of Malta and the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, our co-sponsors, the Australian Federation of Disability Organisation, Autism Research Centre, University of Cambridge, Department of Disability Studies, University of Malta, Inclusion International, International Disability Alliance, Autism Advisory Council Malta, Commission for the Rights of Persons with Disability. And a big thanks goes for our captioners and our sign language interpreters. Thanks and good evening.